from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all feeling fit and well and not suffering from Ashes fever, as I am, which means I've been up nearly all night watching England, just about to lose the first match, and wondering why I did it. Interesting week. I mean, a government that's been going through a very, very tough time, a budget that was looming, and the history over the course of the last few years of repeatedly a budget unfolding within days into chaos, whether it was the pasty tax or whether it was Hammond's perceived attack on the self-employed last year, all of which resulted in U-turns. So the great speculation this week was just how much of a mess would Philip Hammond make of it? And actually what we saw was Spreadsheet Phil turn into the cheeky chappie, chucking out the one-liners, and so far it would appear that the budget hasn't unravelled, and you might say there's a little bit more confidence in the step of the Conservative government. At least there was. But of course, this is politics we're talking about, so an argument is never very far away. And this, I think, really could be a big one. You know, it is the first duty of government to defend the integrity of the nation. And that means defence. That means armed forces, enough of them, trained, equipped, to be able to defend not just us on our home territory, but our interests across the rest of the world. And we could be on the verge of a very big Tory revolt. The plans are to cut troop numbers yet further. Now, I say this against the backdrop that ever since the Conservatives came to power in 2010, albeit it was a coalition then, we have seen reductions in the Army, in the Navy and in the Air Force. And there is now a plan that says by 2025 we could have fewer than 70,000 soldiers in the British Army. And Tobias Ellwood, who's the minister responsible for defence personnel and veterans, is understood to have such concerns about these proposals, he is seriously considering his position. Perhaps in a way not surprising, given that he is actually Lieutenant Colonel Ellwood, and he's still, age 51, signed up with our reserve forces and has fought and served in many campaigns. And Johnny Mercer, who's a Tory member of the Defence Select Committee, relatively new MP, Tory Mercer has said, what is proposed is going too far, and I'm determined to do everything I can as a lowly backbencher, but certainly with a powerful cohort behind me, to make sure we remain the party of defence. We'll talk about that. So he's talking about rebelling. Nicholas Soames, of course, grandson of Sir Winston Churchill, and he has said the parliamentary party has a duty now to unite against further cuts to our defence capability. Defence has been very much out of fashion in political terms over the last few years. When we fight general elections, defence almost doesn't really get a look in. It might have done had Jeremy Corbyn's own preferred option of getting rid of Trident been Labour policy, but of course it wasn't. And I think there's a general feeling amongst the Westminster political elite that the public don't really care much about defence. Well, do you know what? I think they're wrong. I think we care greatly about defence, about our armed forces, about us being capable to do the job. But helping me look at this and make sure I'm not giving you a prejudiced negative view of the Conservatives in office when it comes to defence, because I'm pretty cynical about what they say at elections and then what they do. Helping me through this is Peter Caddick-Adams, defence analyst and military historian at Cranfield University. Peter, good morning.
Nigel, good morning.
Good morning. So I'm basically telling the listeners, Peter, that whenever the Tories are in power, we get thumping great big defence cuts. Would that be a reasonable thing for me to say?
Yeah, historically, that's exactly right. And we can go back as many decades as you want, so it's not just in the last 10 or 20 years. And conversely, generally speaking, under Labour governments, there is an increase. It's often brought about by world affairs, but it's counter to the narrative you'd expect that the Tories tend to boost armed forces and Labour cuts. History has given us the opposite.
Yeah, no. Well, I'm pleased you back me up on that, because I've noticed this many times. So, what are these current plans to cut back our forces? What's your assessment of them?
Well, they're not plans, they're a range of options. Clearly, defence is under a huge squeeze, and as you say, defence hasn't been very fashionable. So it's been in a backwater and really hasn't been able to argue its case alongside the other government ministries. You could alternatively take a different view, and some academics subscribe to this, which is that since David Cameron came to power originally in the coalition, there is an inclination amongst politicians to let defence wind down slowly, very slowly, in order not to allow future generations to undertake something like Iraq in 2003. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case, but that is one interpretation.
What to render us incapable of doing such things?
Absolutely, yeah.
But if we can't launch offensive operations, presumably we'd struggle to mount a good defensive operation.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I'm just saying that's one interpretation that you could draw from the fact. It's not proven, but it's not disproven. But it leaves us in a great state of sort of worry, because that is certainly a conclusion you could draw. And if you're sitting in Moscow or Beijing or in Ankara or somewhere like that, you might look at British capability and British willingness to project power and say, aha, now is our moment.
Which is pretty much what the Argentinians did in 1982, wasn't it? We sent a signal with the withdrawal of HMS Endurance that we weren't taking the South Atlantic seriously, and look what happened. Peter, I wonder what Washington make of all of this, because I understand, President Trump, he's putting more money into US defence. We are leaving a European Union that is about to build its own military, and they've been very clear this week about that. So in a sense, our relationship with America and NATO is perhaps for the next few years more important than it's ever been. Are the Americans going to take us seriously if we cut our army below 70,000 men?
They always take us seriously. And I can remember out in the Gulf in 2003, watching on and listening to sort of senior officers and diplomats poo-poo the idea that we were America's poodle, and acknowledge the fact that sometimes we were America's sheepdog. They and other powers too listen to our opinion, respect it. They don't necessarily go along with it, but it still means that we have a seat on the top table. I think we're more worried about our status than other nations are, but we still need power and we still need the political will to back that up. And I think that's been lost in the big equation. I mean, you can look at defence cuts in two ways: how we regard that in the nation, but how other nations looking out into us regard that, and they're two completely different pictures.
Yeah, because we're not just talking here about manpower cuts; we're also talking about not renewing battle tanks, armoured personnel carriers, things like that. We're talking about kit, perhaps not being state of the art as well. Peter, I'm just going to ask you this: politically, is this the moment at which the Tory backbenchers say enough is enough, in your view?
I'm surprised it's been hasn't exploded before now, because this has been brewing for a long while, and I'm glad it's come to a head. And it's very difficult to draw the line and say, below this we can't do anything, because you have to have the debate about what are the UK Defence Forces for, where are our interests, and what do you want them to do, and that's still being discussed. But just in terms of morale within the UK forces, the number of pieces of kit that are being postponed, all sorts of delays in repairs, recruits not coming through the door, and crucially, all those middle managers who we really need in the armed forces, who are jumping ship early to pursue a second career because they're not sure where defence is going in the next 10 years.
And morale is terrible.
Morale is I don't want to overstate it, but it could be a lot healthier than it is at the moment. Yeah.
Peter,
that's why we need to sort this out.
No, we do. I thank you very much for coming on and giving us your expert opinion, and I've no doubt, Peter, we'll have you back on over the course of the next few weeks. Thank you. And it's interesting, isn't it? Peter Caddick-Adams saying he's surprised in many ways that the Tory backbenchers have stayed quiet on this for as long as they have. Yeah, I am worried what Washington think. And really rather backing that up is Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who's commander of the US Army in Europe, and he said Britain's position as a key ally and a leading member of NATO would be at risk if its armed forces got any smaller. Well, let's just talk you through for a moment how small they've got. In 2010, there were 102,000 soldiers in the British Army. There are now fewer than 80,000 soldiers in the British Army, and these proposed cuts would see it below 70,000. In terms of the Royal Air Force, from the day David Cameron came in, there were 35,000 personnel. There are now 29,000 personnel. And in terms of the Royal Air Force, it's gone from 40,000 personnel to 30,000 personnel. I think we're making a very, very grave error. It is impossible to tell what any future threats to the world may or may not be. And I'm asking you, would you support, as I would, more investment in UK defence? And if you agree with that, call me on 0345 6060 973. Maybe you think the old days have gone, we don't need troops in such big numbers anymore, in which case you can text to 84850. Or perhaps you think we need a different kind of defence force, one that is aimed at countering terrorism, rather than one that needs to confront armies on a battlefield, in which case you can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. The time is now 10:15. Time for the break. We're discussing the dwindling number of members of our armed forces and whether, in fact, there's a false investment going on here. Does it need more money or does it need more targeted money? And when we get to 11 o'clock, we're going to talk about one of the central issues of the Brexit campaign, namely the common fisheries policy and the desire of Leavers for us to come out of that policy. Because the government is talking about transition, there is some doubt as to actually when this might be. And I went out on a fishing boat from the Kent port of Ramsgate a couple of months ago, and we will interview a family fishing on that boat and how quotas impact upon their life. We'll also be talking a bit about the hundreds of thousands of people in this country who go out and try with a rod and line and catch bass, and they could be in for a terrible shock in a few weeks' time as a result of a European Commission judgment. But back to defence. You know, I talked to Peter Caddick-Adams, and the one thing that he and I agreed very strongly on is that if you continue to cut the size of your armed forces, you do send a very strange message to the world, not just to those who might wish us harm, but to those, indeed, who are our closest allies, such as the Americans. My first caller on this is Steve in Cheltenham. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Nigel. I hope you can hear me okay.
I can, very well indeed, thank you. Now, what's your interest in this subject, Steve?
Well, very simply, I've been in the defence industry for a number of years, and unlike Peter, I'm not an analyst, I'm an actualist. Namely, I'm involved in the European defence markets and activities of several nations in Europe and beyond. So I'm aware of what's going on that he's probably not. And I have to say, it's not just about numbers. Like the NHS, Nigel, you can spend billions and have little effect.
Yes.
There's always a demand for more. Well, what does more mean? More people or more technology or more capability? I think the first question is, does more equal better? And that's a question that few people, can answer.
Well, what about, Steve, trying does less equal better?
Less what?
Well, fewer. I mean, what this next round of cuts talks about is not just fewer troops. It actually talks too about not upgrading battle tanks, etc.
Well, wrong again. Personally, I'm involved in the upgrade of battle tanks, and I can tell you now that being involved in the UK battle tank is every bit that people don't expect, and that the government is spending billions on upgrading infantry fighting vehicles, billions, and the capabilities of those is world-class, double plus.
Steve, are you a manufacturer?
No. You're
not, but you're involved in the sale of defence equipment, yeah?
No, I'm involved in the technology behind defence equipment.
Okay, no, fine.
You need to be very, very careful. In the 1950s, it was very easy, Nigel, to see what the threat was. It was very simple. Look to the east, and it was Russia, and they had Germany as a speed bump, and that was it. Now I think the threat is, well, what is it? Is it a roadside bomb? Is it an IED? Is it cyber security? And we're spending billions on cyber security, which is the best way to kill an army, by far.
Yes, I mean, and so somewhere here there's a crossover, isn't there, between what is defence and what do our security services do?
Right, I agree. I mean, of course, there is a limit beyond which you can't go. And I think the trouble is our government is actually extending our forces to missions that they can't quite keep up with, and you need a certain number of, whether it be vehicles or ships or aircraft. And if you take the good example of the F-35, and I'm deeply involved in that program as well. Yeah, it's a massive program of fighter jets, and they cost 4 or 5 times what they were expected to because the American government has suckered everybody in. I think you just need to be mindful that across Europe, everyone's in the same pain. And I also deal with the other governments of Europe. They're also struggling.
But, Steve, the other governments of Europe seem very, very keen to spend nearer 1% on defence rather than the 2% that NATO asks for, don't they?
Yeah, they're right. And they're very clever about that as well, because I think they gang together in different ways through NATO. The Americans, by the way, look at what we're doing in Europe. And don't forget, you can add up all of Europe, all of the rest of the world, nearly, with the exception of perhaps the Russian community, it's about a third of what America spends. They are simply in a...
Yes. No, they are. But you know, they do want strong allies, and they've always taken the United Kingdom very seriously. And one wonders for how much longer that is going to be the case. Steve, let me ask you, I mean, you know, my kind of test for this, if you like, and you may say I'm outdated, but I do understand the cyber threat and all of that. But let me ask you, as somebody involved in this industry, if the Argentinian government was to change and another invasion of the Falkland Islands took place, could we, right now, with the decline of the Royal Navy and the merchant fleets and our services in general, could we send a task force to retake the Falklands now?
Well, we have a different view of taking the fort. First of all, you've got to say what would be the threat. We know what material the Argentinians have got and they could pose against us. For example, use that good example. Could we send 35 warships like we did in 1982?
Yeah.
No, because we don't have that many, number one.
Yes.
But the 4 or 5 we would send would outperform the 35 or 40 we had by a factor of 3 or 4. Put simply, the weaponry we have right now and the sophisticated radar systems are absolutely world-class.
But you couldn't... But okay, I take the point, Steve, but ultimately, however high-tech you are, whatever kit you've got, you still need boots on the ground, don't you?
Right, you're right. No army, there's no war that's ever been fought that's of meaningful value without boots on the ground. You're dead right. Vietnam, South Korea, you can name them all. There, you do need people. Okay, but we wouldn't be on our own. We're not geared up to fight a global war in the way that we were in 1955.
No, I understand that. Steve, do you think it's right that this government should stick to at least 2% on defence spending?
Well, actually, next year and the years after, I think it's ramping up. We are updating several platforms. We're building new vessels, new aircraft. We are looking at different trainers. I think there's a cost of doing defence that is invisible, though, whether it be material, machines, logistics. It's a very complicated market, and it's not just about big kit that you can see trundling on the screens of the TV.
Yeah, no.
If you want to feel, it is very different, and I would urge and suggest wise caution and wise counsel about saying more is better. I think it's more targeted. And if you go and look at what we did in Afghanistan, the weaponry we needed there's no point rolling a tank there. You need something very, very different.
No.
So I would just urge caution against saying...
No, Steve, no, listen, you've made the point absolutely clearly and very, very well, and I thank you for the call. Steve from Cheltenham saying more is not always better. Fine, I understand that. Got to target the money, got to go for high-tech solutions. I understand all of that too, but I just wonder, for the rest of you out there, you know, do you feel a little bit less safe knowing that these kind of cuts are being made in our armed forces? And perhaps you're related to somebody who's currently serving in the armed forces, and I wonder, how is their morale? Matt from Sheffield takes the view by text. He says, it's madness. We are cutting our armed forces, especially during the massive threat of ISIS. Steve from Sutton says, all right, if they say they're not taking on any more, one thing, but promising these boys a career and then having them risking their lives and then dumping them is a betrayal. Well, Steve, there have been examples of that. Examples of people, you know, coming back from Afghanistan and effectively getting their P45s. And that's one of the reasons why I think actually morale is pretty bad. Further defence cuts are utter madness. Switzerland, which is a neutral country, has more battle tanks than we have, says Richard. And Richard, I was driving through Switzerland earlier this week and I saw the Swiss Army out on manoeuvres. And you know what? There were lots and lots of them. Billy is calling me from Camden. He's a first-time caller to this show. Good morning, Billy.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you?
Well, I'm all right, but I've been watching, Billy, since 2010. I've been watching a Tory government that goes to the polls and says, we're the great patriotic party that will stand up for the nation and for the armed forces and for tradition. And what I see is them ramping up spending on things like foreign aid, and yet cutting our armed forces in the most extraordinary way. And I know I get accused, Billy, of knocking the Tories very often on this show.
That's
but,
all right.
but honestly, there's something deeply hypocritical about what they say at election time and then what they do. And I'm just hoping, Billy, I'm hoping that Tobias Ellwood and Johnny Mercer and Nicholas Soames and others who are making noises this morning, I'm hoping they actually stand up and rebel. I really am, Billy.
Well, I actually feel less safe with the cuts. I think the art is a great career choice for men and women who want a career out there. And I think it's bad. I think we should keep Trident.
Yes.
As a deterrent. And be a big player in the world.
Trident, of course, is expensive, and, you know, there's been a big debate about it, but frankly, it doesn't seem there's any other real alternative. The one downside with Trident, Billy, of course, is that it's not entirely our independent weapon, because the Americans have the codes. But all right, so, Billy, you think it matters that we have a big position on the world stage, yeah?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. So you're against these cuts, and you feel a bit less safe.
Yeah, I definitely feel less safe. I've got family in the Falklands.
So right.
If the cuts were in the 80s, then it might have been a different turnout.
Yeah. OK, Billy, no, you've made your point. I'm being told here, of course, they don't have enough money because they're spending 40 billion on your stupid idea to leave the EU. No. My idea is not to spend 40 billion on leaving the EU. I'm not sure why we should spend anything to leave the EU, but more of that perhaps in a moment. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. The time is now 10:30. As it's planned to cut the British Army below 70,000 people, I'm asking whether actually we need some more investment in defence, or are the politicians in Westminster right? Does no one care anymore? Or do we need to spend the money better and target it more at high tech? But before I get to that, a couple of Brexit-related comments that I can't resist this morning. The first is that our good friend Michel Barnier loves this country. He's now saying, of course, that during the transition period, all new EU laws that get made will apply directly to the United Kingdom. But, of course, we won't be able to be in the room and even help discuss their formation. It almost makes you think, doesn't it, of no taxation without representation. But that, apparently, is what the Prime Minister wants to sign us up for. And when she was challenged about this by Jacob Rees-Mogg in the House of Commons, she said she thought it was unlikely that there'd be new EU laws during that period that would apply to us. Well, he's making it very, very clear, Mr. Barnier. And by the way, you know, I wrote him a letter asking for a meeting, and he came back to me and said he'd meet me in the bar. I said that wasn't really good enough. I now do have a date in the new year to go into the Berlaymont building and to meet him, and I'll be following on, of course, from Nick Clegg and Lord Adonis and Ken Clarke and virtually every Remainer in the country who's been to see him. So I will be going in there and trying to make the point that there are 17.4 million people plus now who simply want us to get on with this. And I really rather liked a letter that I saw yesterday from Chris Potter from Otley in West Yorkshire. And this letter was published in the Daily Telegraph yesterday. It said, "Dear Sir, imagine going to an auction and the auctioneer says, this is lot number 120 and we can open the bidding at £2,000. Someone in the room shouts, what is lot 120, please? And the auctioneer replies, I won't tell you until the reserve is reached. That is what the EU is saying to Britain. We should walk away now. Well done, Chris Potter. Because it is, you know, we're being asked to pay some extraordinary sum of money without, at the moment, any guarantee of anything in return at all. They really are putting us in an impossible position, as indeed, to a large extent, now are the Irish government. Their Taoiseach, their PM, Leo Varadkar, and their Commissioner, Hogan, basically saying that Northern Ireland must now stay part of the single market stroke customs union. And I am amazed that the Irish government is taking this line. They're even threatening to veto, you know, future arrangements with the United Kingdom. I do understand, guys, that your farmers need the British market very badly. You sell about 50% of your beef into the UK market. I understand that. I get that. In fact, I'm sympathetic to that. So rather than arguing rather than trying from Dublin to dictate to Westminster what we should or shouldn't do, why don't you go to Brussels and act in the interests of your farmers and your businesses and argue that a continued tariff-free trade deal would be the best solution, not just for the island of Ireland, but for all of us. But unfortunately, that is not what they're doing. We will see whether the Irish Prime Minister survives a vote of confidence that will take place in Dublin this very week. OK, back to defence cuts. And I have to say, I've just, all my life, I've seen this. I've seen Conservative governments who pretend to be strong on defence, and actually they're the ones that always seem to cut. And Labour, ironically, given that the general public perception is it's Tories strong on this, Labour weak on this, Labour generally, in many ways, have been better for the armed forces. I'm going to ask Celia in North Wembley what she thinks about these cuts and whether it really matters. Good morning, Celia.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, what's the point of increasing the defence budget if the army can't get recruits? I mean, apparently people don't want to join the army, and I'm just wondering whether that's because they don't want to go abroad. They're frightened they're going to be sent abroad to fight some war they don't believe in. So if they were told that they were going to just be trained to defend this country, and if anything happened abroad, they could choose as to whether to go or not. Perhaps we'd be able to get some recruits.
Yeah, I don't think we could ever do that, Celia. Look, I think, isn't it a bit chicken and egg here? I mean, I really don't believe that people don't join the army because they fear they might be sent abroad to fight. I do understand that there are people who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan and have asked themselves some very long, hard questions about what those conflicts were about. And of course I understand that. But, Celia, actually this is chicken and egg. They see an army that is diminishing in size. They ask themselves whether it's the right place to be. And actually, Celia, it's actually worse than that. It's worse than people not being recruited. People are leaving. I mean, just for example, Celia, listen to this. Matt from Epsom says, I'm currently serving. I would say morale is very low. The workload is the same. However, there are 20,000 less of us to do it. So many signing off at all ranks. And that, Celia, is now the message I'm getting, is that many in the army, if they see an alternative career to go to, are going for it quickly because they fear that in this atmosphere of cuts, it's not the right place to be. So I think it's a bit chicken and egg, this one.
OK.
That's just my view, but I take your point, Celia, and thank you. Celia thinking, well, maybe it's the fact we've been fighting wars we shouldn't have been. I don't believe it is that. I really, really don't. And a very interesting one here from Joey. Shocking that we can't defend the UK. Is this government blind to the threat of the European army, for which you, Nigel, and Liam Fox were ridiculed? A large trade area with supranational pretensions, a flag, an anthem with eyes on areas like Belarus is a threat. Are we witnessing another 1936? All the signs are there. Wake up, history continually repeats itself, and governments never learn. Joey, I am genuinely concerned about the militarisation of the European Union. I'm genuinely concerned about its expansionist tendencies, and I'm not making this up. It was Mr. Barroso, the former Commission President, who said, we are building an empire. And I think you've seen already in the Ukraine, by provoking the overthrow of an elected leader, that the EU, which has told everybody it's all about peace and goodwill to men, could, at some point in the future, if it does get a powerful military, actually be a destabilising factor. So yes, I'm concerned about it. Kumar is calling me from Ealing. Good morning, Kumar.
Good morning, sir. 3 points.
Yes.
If you're Trident, Brexit/EU, and then finally public finances. Okay. Trident is estimated to cost 100 billion. That's assuming the MOD can bring it on budget and on time. When was the last time the MOD brought anything on budget on time? Look at the Nimrod and look at this aircraft carrier, where for 10 years we were out of the aircraft carrier. We have to rely on the French. God help us. Now,
go
on Trident, when was the a scenario that you can give me that you can envisage a British Prime Minister or a French President pressing the independent nuclear button without the permission and authorization of the President of the United States? It's a total fantasy, and God help us if that happens to be Trump at the time. Turning to
Well, you could argue, Kumar, that actually what Trump has done when he's been travelling around the world, rather than ignoring what's been happening in North Korea. He's tried to wake the rest of the world up to it. He's tried to get the fiercest possible sanctions put on North Korea. He's trying to stop North Korea from carrying on with its program of missile testing. You could argue that what Trump is doing is trying to stop North Korea becoming a nuclear power. Isn't that a good thing to do?
I don't want to get on Trump because we'll go off at a tangent. Let's stick to the point.
Well, I know I am sticking to the point, Kumar, because you said, are there any circumstances in which anybody would ever contemplate using these weapons? And the answer, I think, is, if Mad Kim was in a position where he could fire missiles at us, we've got to have missiles, haven't we?
Do you really want me to comment on Trump? Because flip-flops every...
No, I didn't. I asked you about North Korea. I went back to your question. You said to me, let's take Trump out of it. Let's take Trump out of it, because I know that he raises passions. But if a state like North Korea did have the delivery systems that put us directly under threat, would we not be mad in those circumstances not to have missiles ourselves?
Okay, let me respond. Trump said on the campaign trail that instead of the U.S. defending the allies against North Korea, we should put more nuclear weapons in the hands of the Japanese and the South Koreans, and they should defend themselves. The moment he becomes president, he flip-flops on that. It'll be... I'm not...
Kumar, I've said I'm trying to draw a truce with you about Trump. I'm talking about the argument. Look, you've made the point. Trident costs a fortune, all right? And it does. A fortune. And there are people out there who say, well, actually, to maintain our traditional forces in a modern high-tech era, if we scrap Trident, we'd have more than enough money to do it. All right? Are you arguing, Kumar, that we should scrap Trident?
Absolutely, and spend more on conventional weapons. Because if you look at our biggest enemies, who are they? They're Al-Qaeda, they're ISIS, and they're the Taliban. Are you seriously telling me we're going to use nuclear weapons against them? Of course not. The only way we can defeat them is through conventional weapons.
Kumar, I can't disagree with that point. As it stands, ISIS don't have nuclear capability. Let's all on this Sunday morning pray to God that they never, ever do. And I thank you for your call. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 10:45. Does a British army going down to below 70,000 personnel in the next few years send the wrong message out to the rest of the world? And what's happening with recruitment? What's happening with morale? Now, Celia suggested from North Wembley that the problem was that people won't join because they think the foreign wars that we've been involved in weren't justified. Mick on Facebook takes the opposite view. He says people are leaving or not joining because there is no war to go to. When Iraq and Afghanistan were on, the military were inundated with people wanting to join. I don't know whether that's true. Christine thinks that HS2 also costs a fortune. I know where the money would be spent better. Yeah, well, there's also the point is they're not about the foreign aid budget. I've mentioned it once so far this morning, but I do get a tweet here saying defence should be the first priority for any government. No more foreign aid. Donate privately and invest instead in our armed services. The islands need defending. We need a sign outside every army barracks that says invest to save. And in terms of morale, because this does interest me, Nigel, I'm a weapons technician in the RAF. Do a bit of research and you'll be amazed how many soldiers, technicians, etc. are leaving. And no one seems to care. What a mess, says Kieran. And Kieran, I don't know that it's people don't care, but what I do know from my conversations off camera, and off radio mic, the green room conversation that I've had over the years with leading political figures from all the parties is that they view defence as a very low priority issue because they think people frankly don't care about it, and they think that the way people vote will not alter in terms of the way the government is seen to have dealt with this issue. They don't think it matters. Goodness me. If the Conservative Party felt their vote was threatened, they wouldn't have cut since 2010 in the way that they have. That's my view. Please tell me I'm wrong on 0345 6060 973. And John is calling me from Gravesend. John, good morning.
Very good morning to you. Procurement is the problem. We're not getting enough bang for our buck. It works out like this. The UK spends 40 billion on defence.
Yep.
Russia, 60 billion. Americans, because they're the biggest killers anyway, 600 billion per year. I want to know how it is that Russia can have a Sukhoi Su-35 flanker at half the cost of an American F-35, known in America as the flying garbage truck. Why it is...
So, John, we could be paying.
Is being offered.
So we could be paying too much money. We could be paying too much money for kit. Is point number one. Point number two, of course, is I guess our soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women are paid a bit more than the Russians. And could it be that the Soviets have a smaller bureaucracy than we do in the Ministry of Defence? Is that possible?
Well, they've got an army of a force of 1.9 million now been upped to support, so we can't call it that their wages are low.
Right.
It's expensive. This week, the MOD has offered experienced helicopter pilots a £70,000 golden handcuff to keep them in their jobs for 6 years. The MOD has announced that in the last 5 years they've lost 1,049 helicopter pilots that have left the Army and the Navy, and there's only 508 joined up. And the other point is this: the Army the military should multi-role. In other words, forget overseas adventures. They can do their defence job, and they can also be used in a civil capacity for border security, ports, and all that. And they can then be given. You get spearhead battalions that are on duty. They then can be used in civil society, attached to the police, with the powers of special constable, and they can rotate on that basis.
Well, yes. I mean, I have to say, I think in times of big civil emergencies, then of course the armed forces could be a massive, massive resource and help to our police forces, and I do understand that, John. But your basic point is, it isn't just about the money we spend. You don't think it's being spent properly, do you?
We've got Lockheed Martin and American companies that have got little niche industries around the UK. And then what happens is the politicians are offered the F-35, which was offered to them before when it was just a computer program.
Yep.
It wasn't even a built model. And then what happens then is, well, if you don't buy the F-35, we might have to shut a couple of factories, then constituencies. So in other words, having American influence or in industry in the UK forces us to buy American. And even Trump himself is fighting to get the F-35 bill down, and we're going to be suckers, and we're going to pay full price.
John, you're not the first person to tell me that we've made some bad spending decisions in terms of defence kit. I've heard that from a former cabinet minister too. I thank you very much for your call. And John saying, look, we haven't always spent money wisely. We've paid over the odds for some of the kit that we've got. And even if that is true, and I suspect that it probably is, that's still not a reason, in my view, for cutting the army down below 70,000 people. That's how I feel about it. I think it's obvious what they're up to. We are going to be part of an EU army. We're just not being told yet. Mark my words, says Madeline. Well, Madeline, we pushed very hard on this show a few weeks ago when it came to PESCO, this advancement of military integration within the European Union. And I'm pleased to say at this stage, we are not a part of it. However, we certainly haven't ruled out doing joint exercises, etc., with an emerging European army. And one of the big arguments being made about the European army by Mr. Juncker and others is you don't need to spend 2% of your budget on this. You can probably spend 1% because we'll get economies of scale across Europe. And that at the very moment when Trump is saying, hey guys, unless you lot all are prepared to pay your 2%, we might seriously consider whether our support for you, is there whenever you need it to be. So this is really a really big moment. And I feel I do want, and by the way, it doesn't mean every single American foreign policy decision we should follow. A special relationship is about being able to say no as well as yes, depending on circumstances, just as Harold Wilson did to Lyndon Johnson over Vietnam back in 1966. But I do really think that we need to be of a sufficient size for the Americans to continue viewing us as their most important ally in the world. I would rather put my future security with America, whoever its president is, than with Mr. Juncker and Barnier and the boys in Brussels. That's how I feel. I wonder how Greg in Reading feels on this subject. Good morning, Greg.
Morning.
Good morning. So what do you think, Greg? I mean, are we cutting back too far?
Yeah, we're cutting back too far. So I'm currently serving in the armed forces.
Right.
And we're cutting back too far. So at the moment, we're getting cuts on defence, so on spending. So then we go to civilian companies or industry to fill the gaps because they can sometimes provide it for cheaper. And then you're getting stuck in a loophole of nobody's doing their job, or not everybody's doing their job at certain points because it's taken by industry, which then leaves soldiers sitting around bored, which makes them more likely to sign off or more likely to get out the armed forces.
And Greg, are you seeing people just getting out if they find an alternative job to go to?
Yeah, I know a lot of people in there constantly just looking or waiting their time till they can either get out or just riding out until their pension kicks in so they can get out. So,
and can I ask, without too many details, can I ask which branch of the armed forces you're in?
It's having the Royal Logistics Corps.
Right. Okay. Well, that's quite a lot of information actually, but if you're prepared to give it, fine. And so Greg, morale is awful. What could the government do to turn this around? What signal? What message do you men and women serving in the armed forces need? What do you need to hear?
So we need to be looked after more by the government. So a lot of soldiers are living in substandard accommodation because there's no money to be spent on it. Yep. And when that's your home and that's your life, and you're living in somewhere with no hot water or no heating, it definitely takes a brunt in the soldiers' morale. And then having nothing to do because it's been put to industry, or in some cases, you're overworked because they've cut so many soldiers or so many have left, and then you're doing the job of 3-4 people and still expected to deliver the same results with less resources and less time.
Greg, a very depressing phone call, but thank you for making it and being as frank as you were. And my last call on this subject is Hannah, who's calling from Leeds. Hannah, good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm just listening to what Greg was saying there. It's absolutely the same as what my husband's experienced. He's in the military, and he's getting out as soon as his paperwork comes through, basically because he now fundamentally can't do his job because just the resources keep getting pulled out from under him. A couple of months ago, he spent weeks and weeks planning quite a serious exercise. For every time he went to go and get approval for this exercise to go through, he would go up to the top corridor and they'd say, no, there's another £10,000 got cut off the budget for this. You've got to go back and do the whole thing again. So actually the amount of time that he wasted because of cuts was just ridiculous. And you hear it from every single soldier. It's 4-letter word, I'm getting out. That is the. Do
you feel Hannah, as a forces family, do you feel let down by the government?
I think it's not so much let down by the government. It's this constant battle. We're not as important to people as things like the NHS or schools, because people understand the NHS and schools. And the thing which happens the most is that people, the electorate,
a lot of it's about votes too, isn't it? A lot of it's about that. Hannah, we're out of time. I thank you for your call. A lot of frank phone calls there. People not feeling very happy serving in the armed forces. In the next hour, I'm going to highlight the plight of UK fishermen. Back in August, I went down to Ramsgate. I met Eddie on his fishing boat called the Boy Joshua. The aim of the trip was to find out the impact of a CFP on our fishing stocks. All of it, of course, being set and regulated by the European Union. I want to know, do you think it's time that we left the Common Fisheries Policy? Should we do it now? If so, call me on 0345 6060 973. Or maybe you think a transition means we stay in it, in which case text to 84850 and go to the LBC website, lbc.co.uk, to see video and pictures of my trip out there and my encounter with the UK Border Force.